Week 2, Day 2, Consumer Behavior. Consumer behavior is defined as the entire broad spectrum of things that affect, derive from, or form the context of human consumption. Like all human behavior, the behavior of consumers is complicated. However, advertisers must make it their job to understand consumers if they want to have success in creating effective advertising. We will describe consumer behavior from two different perspectives. The first portrays consumers as reasonably systematic decision makers who seek to maximize the benefits they get from their purchases. The second portrays consumers as social beings. They are active interpreters, meaning they're meaning makers of advertising whose membership in various cultures, subcultures, societies, and communities significantly affect their interpretation and responses to advertising. Consumer behavior is very complex. Psychological, social, cultural, historical, and economical all make up consumer behavior. So we're going to start by talking about the first perspective, the consumer as a systematic decision maker. One way to view the consumer behavior is as a logical sequential process with the individual gaining benefits from a product or service. In this basic view, individuals act as purposeful decision makers who take matters one step at a time. So they're very logical. Whatever they do has a purpose behind it, and they act in steps and they take one step at a time. Their decision making is a 4-step sequential process. The first one is need recognition. The consumption process begins when people perceive a need. A need state arises when the desired state of affairs differs from one's actual state of affairs. Many factors can influence the need state of consumers. So, differ meaning I need a car, I don't have a car. So, that's the difference there. So, that's a need state. Basic human needs, as suggested by Maslow, well known hierarchy: psychological, safety, love, belonging, self esteem, and self accusation may be manifest in the need recognition stage of consumption. Another element of need recognition is that brands should provide benefits that fulfill consumers' needs. Functional benefits, for example, convenience, reliability, nutrition, durability, economic. Consumers may also choose brands that provide emotional benefits. That's more subjective and may be perceived differently from one consumer to the next. Brands help consumers feel pride, avoid guilt and shame, relieve fear, and experience intense pleasure. These are some of the emotional benefits that can come from consuming brands. The second step in their decision making process is informational search and alternative evaluation. Information for the decision is acquired through an internal or external search. An internal search is information is drawn on personal experience, prior knowledge, or prior exposure to advertising. So you're thinking about buying this brand, and if you're this type of person, you think about, have you bought it before? Has anybody ever told you about it before? Have you seen ads about it before? That's your internal search. It's possible that internal search will not turn up enough information to yield a decision. In that case, an external search involves visiting retail stores to examine the alternatives, seeking input from friends and relatives about their experiences with the products in question, or pursuing professional product evaluations furnished in publications like Consumer Reports. When consumers are in an active information gathering mode, they also may be receptive to details, informational advertisements delivered through print media or any type of media. The consideration set is the number of alternatives that are considered by consumers during their consumption problem solving process. Consumers will then form evaluations based on the characteristics or attributes that brands in their consideration set have in common. These are referred to as evaluative criteria. Evaluative criteria will differ from one product category to the next and can include many factors. So these factors could be the price, the texture, the warranty terms, the color, the scent, the fat content, and things of that nature. Those are evaluative criteria. The next step in decision making process for these type of people is purchase. At this point, the consumer makes a commitment to a brand and a source of supply. Then you have your next step. After the brand has been purchased, there's post-purchase use and evaluation. The goal for marketers and advertisers must not simply be to generate a sale. The goal must be to create satisfied and perhaps even loyal consumers. Advertising can play an important role in consumer satisfaction by creating appropriate expectations for a brand's performance or by helping the consumer who has already purchased the advertised brand feel good about doing so. Cognitive dissonance is the anxiety or regret that lingers after a difficult decision. So let's talk a little bit more about that. This is the feeling of being uncomfortable and having tension, which comes from holding two conflicting thoughts in the mind at the same time. So that's like if you're buying a car and you're trying to decide, should I buy a Honda or a Toyota? This is most common when the item is a higher priced item, when there are several close alternatives. So if you have two cars that are so much the same, the product or service warrants a long-term commitment. So examples are like if you bought a stereo or a car or life insurance or a computer. Those are long-term commitments, so you want to make sure you're making the right decisions. When the cognitive dissonance is expected, it makes good sense for the advertiser to reassure buyers with detailed information about its brand. So how would they go about doing this? So they need to reassure the buyer by using post-purchase contact. So through email or text message, you're sending an email saying, oh, you made such a wonderful purchase by deciding to buy this Honda or something like that. It's a great opportunity to communicate since the buyer is in a state of heightened awareness. Like they just made this huge purchase. It's a long-term commitment, so they're in a state of heightened awareness. Working to ensure satisfaction increases brand loyalty. So if you're an advertiser of a brand and you're checking back with them to make sure they're satisfied with your brand that they purchased, you're more likely to have brand loyalty. So there are four modes of consumer decision making. Now remember, we're still talking about the systematic decision makers. These four modes of consumer decision making are determined by a consumer's involvement and prior experiences with the product or service in question. The first one is sources of involvement. Involvement is the degree of perceived relevance and personal importance occupying the choice of a certain product or service. Many factors contribute to the level of involvement in any given decision. So the first one would be interests like cooking and photography, pet ownership or exercise, fitness. All of these things can enhance your involvement. When risk is associated with a purchase, high price of the item, or because the consumer will have to live with the decision for a long time, elevated involvement is likely. Consumers can also derive important symbolic meaning from products and brands. Some purchases can also tap into deep emotional concerns of motives like friendship or being patriotic or something of that nature. Involvement varies between product category and between the individuals. So the first one is involvement. The second one is experience. Prior experience with a product category and brands is pretty self-explanatory. When a consumer has more experience, the involvement is typically lower. So you've bought this brand before, so you have prior experience, so it's not a lot of involvement in the decision-making process. So here's an example. This is a print ad. So look at this ad. Is this a high or low involvement decision for the consumer? This is an ad for State Farm. It says hard work, attention to detail, personal service, sound familiar? We live where you live. So this would be considered a high involvement because it's something that's expensive and it's something that you have to live with. You might have to sign a contract or something of that nature. So this would be an ad that represents that. So let's look at the four modes of consumer decision making. The ideals of involvement and prior experience produce four different types of consumer decision making. So if you look across the top, you have involvement, low and high, and then you on the left, you have experience, low and high, and then you have the quadrants in the middle. So let's start with number one, limited problem solving. Experience and involvement are both low in limited problem solving. This is a common mode of decision making. A consumer will be less systematic. It's not a problem that is interesting or engaging, so the information search is limited. Examples are low-cost products with some type of utility value like toothpaste or disposable diapers or something like that. So common products, you don't have to research it. You pretty much know what you like or what you want. The second one, which has the high involvement and low experience, when consumers are inexperienced and the setting is highly involving, they engage in extended problem solving. Consumers go through a deliberate decision-making process that begins with explicit need recognition, proceeds with careful internal and external search, continues through alternative evaluations and purchase, and ends with a lengthy post-purchase evaluation. So they don't have experience with this brand or category, but it's a high involvement product. So that would be like buying your first car and never been around someone buying a car and what that process is. So moving down to number 3, low involvement, high experience. So we're going to talk about here habit or variety seeking. So first, habit refers to buying a single brand repeatedly. This occurs where a decision is not involving and the consumer repurchases from that category over and over again. So this would be convenience goods of all sorts that represents this quadrant. And then you have variety seekers. This refers to the tendency of a consumer to switch among various brands in a category in a seemingly random pattern. This is not to say that a consumer will buy just any brand, but he or she probably has 2, maybe to 5 brands that provide similar levels of satisfaction. However, from one purchase occasion to the next, the individual will switch brands within this set for the sake of variety. So say you have a favorite toothpaste, you have 3 different types. So whichever one you see first, that's the one you grab. So that would be a variety seeker. And then the 4th quadrant is high involvement, high experience. These are brand loyal people. So high involvement and extensive prior experience, consumers demonstrate brand loyalty when they repeatedly purchase a single brand. It's important to distinguish brand loyalty from simple habit. So brand loyalty is based on highly favorable attitudes toward a brand and a conscious commitment to find this brand each time, as opposed to habits that are merely consumption simplifiers that are not based on deeply held convictions. Okay? Just to further integrate the brand loyal versus habit purchasing, think about when a brand loyal consumer arrives at a store and finds his or her favorite brand is out of stock. What do you expect to happen next? So think about, what is your favorite brand? You go to the store to purchase it and they don't have it. Let's say you a Samsung user, Android, or iPhone user, and you go in the store to buy your brand and they don't have it. What do you do? The answer is they will wait until it is available or find it at another store. So that's being brand loyal. Habitual purchasing involves buying a single brand repeatedly as a solution to a mundane consumption problem. The motive is just to keep things simple. So with brand loyalty, we also see repeat purchasing of a single brand, but in this case, the sequence of purchases is based on highly favorable brand attitudes and a conscious commitment to the brand. For the brand loyal consumer, out of stock means that they will wait for the item to be available. But for a habit purchaser, out of stock simply provides an incentive to try another brand. So just keep in mind, both have repeat purchases of the same brand. But brand loyalty, if it's out of stock, they'll wait for the item to be available or find it somewhere else. And habitual, if it's out of stock, they'll just try another brand at this time. Okay. So this is the slide that we saw earlier when we talked about 2 perspectives of consumer behavior. So all of what we've talked about so far deals with systematic decision makers. So now let's talk about the second perspective, the consumer as a social being. The consumer as a decision maker tells only part of the story. This approach often takes consumer behavior out of its natural social context, making consumers appear overly rational. So the second perspective on consumer behavior is concerned with social and cultural processes. It draws on anthropology, sociology, and communication. Okay, so your culture or social membership defines your purchases. Culture is the total ways of life for people and the social legacy that individuals acquire from his or her groups. It is the way we eat, the way we groom ourselves, the way we celebrate, and mark our space or position. Cultures are not necessarily geographic. It can be a teen tech nerd culture. It can be a goth culture. It can be a country club culture. It can be a Samsung culture. It can be an Apple culture and things of that nature. So all of these different things make up your social culture and your beliefs based on these different things. So think about an example of highly visible cultural rituals practiced annually in the United States. And what is the importance of buying and consuming for the rituals to be important? So take a second and think about that. So some annual cultural rituals could be defined as major holidays. So like Easter, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and so on. Some view national holidays as consumption festivals, and brands and advertisers use this opportunity to put their brands in the forefront of our minds. So think about, let's just say Easter. You know, everybody dresses up, go to church, and buy Easter baskets and spend money on eggs for Easter hunting and dyeing. They buy new clothes. So as an advertiser, you have to put your brand out in the forefront at that time to go with whatever that ritual is. We also have social class or stratification. So stratification provides a broad context that refers to a person's standing in the social system produced by systematic inequalities in wealth, income, education, power, and status. Although Americans like to think of themselves as a classless society, this is clearly not the case. There are rich and poor, there are upper and lower classes. Income alone does not, however, define social class effectively. Members of a society within social strata behave similarly and have similar views. So, taste, for example, refers to consumer preferences like consumption through taste, media habits, and exposure to advertising. This includes what one wears, where one lives, and how one talks. For example, we may think of tennis rather than bowling as belonging to an upper class, or chess rather than checkers, for example. And then you have the ideal of culture capital. This is the value that cultures place on certain consumption practices, like ordering wine with dinner, flying first class, having an original piece of artwork hanging on your walls. This is cultural capital for some consumers. A modern context for cultural capital include knowing the coolest new brands that are out, or the coolest bands on YouTube, or having an iPhone or a Samsung. That's part of the modern context for cultural capital. So let's end this by talking about 5 sociological factors in consumer behavior and advertising response. The first one is family. One of our best predictors of the brands adults use is the ones their parents use. This is called an intergenerational effect. So my mom used Tide, so I'm going to buy Tide because that's what I'm familiar with. Life stage effects. Advertisers are often interested in things like the age of the youngest child, the size of the family income. For example, the age of the youngest child living at home tells an advertiser where the family is in terms of needs and obligations. So that is like toys, investment instruments for college savings, clothing, and vacations, things of that nature. The second one is race and ethnicity. The question of how race figures into consumer behavior is difficult. We experience discomfort from the desire to say race doesn't matter, we're all the same. And on the other hand, not wanting to or not being able to deny the significance of race in reaching ethnic subcultures with advertising that has ethnic relevance. Still, race is something that does inform one's social identity to a varying degree. One is not blind to one's own ethnicity. African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and other ethnic groups have culturally related consumption preferences that can be communicated about in advertising. The third factor is politics. This broad influence plays itself out in factors such as increased globalization of brands and greater worldwide acceptance of consumer culture. In addition, global movements like country labor practices and politics can create preferences for green brands. The next one is gender. Gender is the social expression of sexual biology, sexual choice, or both. There is, however, no definite list of gender differences in consumption because the expression of gender, just like anything else social, depends on the situation of the social circumstances. One market where this holds true is the LGBTQ plus market. These consumers have large disposable incomes and have been ignored by marketers until recently. Understanding the difference of cultures is very important in advertising. The last one is community. This is defined as a wide-ranging relationship or solidarity over a rather undefined area of life and interest. It extends well beyond the ideal of geographic places. Advertisers are becoming increasingly aware of its power. Brand communities are groups of consumers who feel they have something in common and share purpose and grounded or are attracted to the same type of consumer goods or services. So, like owners of Doc Martens or owners of BMWs, owners of Apple products, they experience a sense of connectedness by virtue of their common ownership. So, this last slide summarizes the whole process of consumer behavior influences, and we've talked about all of them that fit into what makes people make decisions to buy different brands or product categories.